Protesters shut down I-630 in Little Rock. Justice for George Floyd, walking with signs.
Interstate 630, the interstate was shut down earlier today.
We have to ask to not be killed. Protesting, stand out here all day.
While the protesters were peaceful, they say they feel far from peace.
Let me be clear that I will not tolerate acts of violence or destruction of property.
These protesters shut down Interstate 630.
Yeah, it's highly symbolic. I-630 represents that very physical form of segregation that you can see and is very tangible. You know, when you look at I-630, it's important to see it in its larger context of a process that was already taking place from the 1930s onwards. But the I-630 was a kind of hard line, a hard concrete line that really demarked the different parts of the city that were already beginning to shift in terms of demographics at the time. And of course, today, it's a very strong indicator of racial demographics in the city. That south of I-630 is predominantly African-American Latino, and north of 630 is predominantly white.
You can't divorce the timeline of these proceedings when it comes to the desegregation of American education with the growth of the national interstate system. The justification is that American automobiles, the production of American automobiles was increasing traffic in cities across the country. However, when you look at the timeline of these developments in the 1950s, you have to understand that because history doesn't happen in a vacuum, these people they are seeing the Supreme Court strike down separate but equal in 1954. They are literally watching the transition of white supremacy in education being removed. And not just in 1954, this has been happening since the 1940s when people were suing to get into higher education. You had individuals suing to get into the University of Oklahoma, the University of Texas. You had the admittance of Silas Hunt here at the University of Arkansas in the 1940s. So going into the 1950s, American officials and local city civic officials, everybody saw the writing on the wall when it came to the social hierarchy in public education. And so then the impetus to try to create this division and reinforce these white supremacist ideologies became even greater, because now the threat for the miscegenation and the intermixing of Black and white is happening at the elementary level now. There's this mentality in late 19th century America, right before the beginning of the 20th century, called social Darwinism. It's this idea that people are fixed in their places in society. So if you were rich and wealthy, it's because you evolved to be rich and wealthy. If you were poor, it was because you were evolved and supposed to be poor, right? So there wasn't much social mobility. Black people proved that wrong. Black people proved that 100% wrong. And that debunks the idea of Black inferiority right there, that these people are less than citizens or less than human and incapable of citizenship. That debunks that right there, because you have Black congressmen, you have Black representatives, you have Black people voting. So there's the effort to try to reassert white supremacy throughout the 20th century, throughout these various means, where city officials see this Black affluence, they see Black wealth, they see Black business owners, they see Black communities thriving. But the fact that it's being created and orchestrated by Black communities is a direct debunk of white supremacy.
We were refugees, and so we were all over the country, everywhere, including Arkansas. So after the enslaved people migrated here in the downtown area of Arkansas, of Little Rock, we started to grow out of insurmountable odds. There was a lot of churches built in the downtown area for African American people. We started our own businesses down on 9th Street. So again, we were like in the downtown area, so that would be the likelihood where our businesses would be, right? But then we also had to migrate and settle someplace. And Dunbar Historic District was that place that Black people, African American people settled. When you look at it, and then when you think about it, it really was a total demise of a community, because when you say, okay, 9th Street is where our businesses are, Dunbar is where our neighborhood is, where we actually live, but when your business is taken away, when you put an interstate down the middle of it, and people pass straight by the business district, there's no more commerce. So it completely destroys the businesses. And if you destroy the economics of a neighborhood, then you destroy everything about that neighborhood. You do everything about that community, because there's no ability to grow your community if there's no economic development.
That whole entire area was like the most booming spot for Black people in the state, like really in the region, because Arkansas itself had a more lax reputation when it came to race relations than other southern states like Mississippi and Alabama, you know, and even Texas to an extent. It was because of spaces like West 9th Street, where you had all of this Black affluence, where Black people could come and have a good time and grow their businesses and build their communities, like the Dunbar Neighborhood Association. They would build these communities because in Arkansas, it was possible to build these communities in a way that it wasn't in many other southern states. And so this was attractive. This would bring more Black people into the space. And as Black people went into Little Rock through the early 20th century, because of the changing economies, like Arkansas was getting away from an agricultural economy and shifting more towards an industrial economy. This pushed people into Little Rock to get factory jobs, to get jobs in manufacturing and all these different industrial spaces. And they needed somewhere to go. They needed stuff to do. And not only that, they needed space to be and grow their community. So that's what brought people to those spaces. And the research shows that urban renewal really began these processes of destroying West 9th Street. Urban renewal had a greater impact, even more so than the impact of Interstate 630's construction on West 9th Street, because it actually began to remove these communities. It effectively relocated these communities to begin the processes of redeveloping these spaces. And then when Interstate 630 came through, it ultimately just destroyed. It was the capstone on the reorientation of that space. Interstates shape our social psychology, because these are things that we are all aware of in the space. And it makes you understand the feeling, the different feeling that you have being in one space versus another, is because the design of the space was created with the individual in mind that they were intending to place in these spaces. Containing these individuals into certain spaces became a relevant solution. So containing certain populations into certain demographics became the objective of these urban development projects like urban renewal and like, as we see with interstate construction, to where you are solving two issues. You're confining certain demographics to certain spaces. Which confines social justice movements to certain spaces. It confines the spread of what was known as subversive influences it confines those to certain spaces. And it keeps those spaces out of the eyesight of white commuters who are going back and forth between suburbia and downtown Little Rock. You don't even see those spaces because of the freeway itself. So it's out of sight, out of mind, right? If white laborers decided to strike, or if there was a need to try to access cheap labor, there was a place to go find them because they are contained in these certain spaces. And therefore, if these areas are simply colonies for Black labor to exist, then there's no need to invest into the health and wellness of these spaces overall. What you see is the hyper-policing of these spaces. You see the large police station that's built right off of 13th Street. You see the investment into the continued containment of these individuals in these spaces. Where the investment comes to shows you the intent of the officials itself. These policies now are justifiable through the language, right? It becomes easier to stomach these things because not only are they out of sight, out of mind, you don't see them, but now the language is, okay, we're doing something that's economically beneficial for the city.
that we should all get together and work together to build our communities back again. Because we all want the same thing. We want great education for our children. We want to feel safe in our communities. And I think the way that we get that is to build a model. And that's what we're trying to do in the Dunbar Historic Neighborhood.
Unless we start getting flying cars, I mean, the automobile influences American policy at a significant level. And, you know, the National Highway System provides an ease of communication that would prevent the overall overhaul of, you know, this system itself, you know. So that's not a realistic objective or a realistic target or goal from my perspective. I think it really is just about the creativity of our American public policy to provide solutions for this issue that was created at the American level.
Yeah, I've had people who say to me, well, you know, it's just a natural phenomenon. People just like to live in their own communities, birds of a feather flock together, etc., and all those kinds of things. But, you know, if you accept those arguments, then the question becomes, why is it that the African American community chose to live in the poorer parts of town with fewer resources, and whites just chose to live in the parts of town that have more resources and better schools and private schools and all those kinds of things, you know? Ultimately, the idea that individuals made those decisions and they just turned out worse for the majority of the African American population, the white population, doesn't actually hold much water. Those are all the difficult decisions that have to be made. But more broadly, you know, building a consensus and a desire for change and confronting the way that the city looks and being determined to change it, and having a large enough of consensus of people who want to have change is an important first step.